Are we live?
Wait, it's going live now.
Hi. Are we live? Hello there. Hi. Are we live?
So hi, my name is Sebastian Budgen. I'm a founding member of Historical Materialism Journal and the book series and the conferences, some of which you would already be familiar with. So I wanted just to pitch to you the idea of you subscribing to the journal firstly. The journal comes out 4 times a year, published by Brill, over 1,000 pages of extremely important and stimulating Marxist theory and Marxist history. We have a discount at the moment for individual subscribers around the time of the London conference, and we very strongly both request and demand that you subscribe to the journal, that you get other people to subscribe to the journal, and of course that you get your institution, if you're part of a university or other institution, to subscribe to the journal. We need more subscribers for this project to be able to expand and continue. The second thing I really wanted to push was the book series. The book series you also probably be familiar with. It's published by Brill Academic Press, and then all the volumes come out 12 months later with Haymarket Books in Chicago, paperbacks. We have more than 200 volumes published now, translations of original work, of document collections, of translations from Marxist theory from across the world, from Japan to China to India to Latin America, very important Latin American list shaping up in the book series, and so on. It's a really crucial intervention in Marxist literature, in making Marxist theory available. That really hasn't existed on this scale since the 1970s. So we'd like you to look at the book series, buy individual volumes, perhaps take up the offer of the book club that Haymarket is promoting. And also, of course, if you're part of an institution, to get your institution to buy as many volumes as possible. Those are the 2 key elements of our activity, aside from the conferences, the journal and the book series. And we think it would be, it's essential basically for us, for our existence, for us to be able to continue to thrive, for those to expand. So please subscribe to the journal, buy the books in the book series, publicize both around you, and help us build the Historical Materialism project. Thanks.
Hi. My name is Sebastian Budgen. Are we live? Just checking. Okay, my name is Sebastian Budgen. I'm a member of the editorial board of Historical Materialism, journal, book series, and conferences, and I welcome you to this session on the penultimate day of the Historical Materialism 2020 online conference. This session is entitled The Pandemic and Response in India, and we have 2 papers. So the first paper is going to be delivered by Ashwin Varghese and Aishwarya Rajeev. Ashwin is a PhD scholar in sociology at the School of Liberal Studies, Ambedkar University, Delhi. And Aishwarya is also a PhD scholar in economics at the School of Liberal Studies at Ambedkar University too. And the title of their paper is Surviving Capitalism and COVID-19, Lessons from Kerala. So they will be both speaking on that paper, and then they will be followed by Paromita Chakrabarti, who is an associate professor in the Department of English at HR College in Mumbai. She is also the author of a chapter that's just come out in a book published by Brill. The book is called Violence, Probing the Boundaries Around the World, published in August 2020, and her chapter is called Women's Bodies, Men's War, the Political Economy of Military Rape and Gender Violence. The title of Paromita's paper today is Such a Long Journey, Pandemic Moves the Indian State, ? So they'll both papers will be between 15 and 25 minutes, and then we will have time for questions. Questions should be put via the chat on YouTube, on the YouTube video. Then I'll read out the questions as long as they are not completely mad in the discussion, and give chance for speakers to come back and also obviously respond to each other if they like. So first paper then is Ashwin Varghese and Aishwarya Rajeev, Surviving Capitalism and COVID-19, Lessons from Kerala. Take it away.
Hi everyone, thanks Sebastian for the introduction, and thanks for inviting us to this panel. In the time allotted to us, we would like to first briefly chronicle Kerala's response to the outbreak, then contextualize Kerala's response within its history of left politics and development strategies, and then end by identifying limitations and suggesting possible ways forward. We'll share our screen for the first part of this presentation. The COVID-19 pandemic has plunged both advanced and nascent capitalist countries into severe crisis, while countries and federal states with socialist and/or communist leanings have not only averted massive tolls, but have also emerged as possible models of organizing state and society, giving precedence to people rather than corporations, finance, and big businesses. This paper argues that Kerala's response to the outbreak under its left government exemplifies a humane approach to this crisis. In this regard, we may start by looking at this graph showing all India figures as on November 9th, 2020. With confirmed cases at around 85 lakhs, active cases at around 5 lakhs, cured cases at around 79 lakhs, and deaths at around 1.2 lakhs. This graph basically shows the trajectory of the COVID cases since March 12th, 2020. Contextualizing Kerala's response in this national situation, we know that early response was the key to Kerala's subsequent success. K.K. Shailaja, the Health and Social Welfare Minister of Kerala, began preparations with the news of the outbreak in Wuhan in January 2020, anticipating the return of students from Kerala who were studying in Wuhan. Kerala started tracking, testing, quarantining, and contact tracing. The state actually declared an emergency in February 2020 itself. It was in early March that WHO declared COVID-19 as a pandemic. And subsequently on 24th March, India declared a nationwide lockdown with just a 4-hour notice. On a national scale, as the pandemic unfolded, the public health crisis escalated into an economic and humanitarian crisis. More than 90% of the workforce in India is in the informal sector. And with this sudden lockdown, workers suddenly faced loss of income, livelihoods, life, and access to food. Soon the situation became such that for a vast majority of the population, the probability of death due to starvation was more than the probability of death due to COVID. This fueled one of the worst exodus of migrant workers in more than 7 decades. Multitudes embarked on perilous journeys, walking hundreds of kilometers to reach their homes. And many were trapped in homes, grappling with anxiety, violence, and domestic abuse. Meanwhile, Kerala anticipated a toll on its health infrastructure, the need for psychosocial support, and access to food, all of which it tackled by deploying frontline workers to serve the people and not only to enforce the lockdown. For instance, the police in Kerala was also delivering supplies to households while obviously also controlling movement. During the pandemic, the state government set up at least 2 COVID-19 dedicated hospitals in each district. The government instituted a longer quarantine of at least 28 days initially, built thousands of shelters for migrant workers, stranded by this nationwide shutdown, and initiated counseling services and telemedicine portals for consultation and psychosocial support for people in quarantine. Welfare pensions were released before the due date so that people would have money in their hands. The Community Kitchen Initiative, through the local self-government department and distribution of millions of cooked meals and free ration under the public distribution scheme, are indicative of a humane and well-structured response and relief strategy. We note here that the decentralized nature of governance and strong community involvement are common underlying factors in all of these measures. With economic activity severely plummeting, the nationwide lockdown was eased June onwards to aid a faltering economy. Till then, Kerala's story had already received international attention due to its containment strategy, which kept COVID transmission at very low levels. With community transmission and economic crisis, however, the story changed. With the easing of lockdown, nearly 500,000 workers returned to the state from other parts of India and from the Gulf countries. Kerala was faced with a surge in COVID cases, as can be seen from this graph, which includes figures from some other big states as well for reference. This graph shows day-wise active cases. The black line here represents Kerala, showing a surge after June. However, if we consider the next graph, which compares the deaths across these states, we note that Kerala has managed to maintain a very low death toll despite this surge, with its percentage being one of the lowest in the world. Now, most epidemiologists believe that Kerala has done a good job on the whole. It has maintained one of the lowest fatality rates, and the hospitals are not yet overwhelmed by this surge of patients. This was made possible by a robust public health system, which the government, in response to the new situation, is now expanding to meet current needs. Kerala's Finance Minister, Dr. Thomas Isaac, characterized Kerala's response by saying, "What distinguishes Kerala in this lockdown is the empathy and concern for ordinary citizens with which it is being implemented." This obviously prompts us to look at why Kerala was able to do what it did, especially in post-colonial neoliberal India. And Ashwin will explore this in the next section.
Um, we argue that the state's preparedness was not only an immediate response, but relied on the developments that the state ushered in as part of its left development strategy and democratic decentralized governance, such as the development of a robust public distribution system, an accessible and affordable public healthcare system, and a politically aware and assertive society. Since its inception in 1957, Kerala, as the first democratically elected communist government in the country and second in the world, consistently averted a bourgeois takeover of the state's developmental agenda. We may take note of Kerala's consistently high social sector spending and history of investment in priority sectors like food, education, and healthcare. Kerala's highly effective public distribution system is recognized as one of the best in the country. Investment in education has led to high literacy rates in the state, and investment in robust public healthcare has led to high access to basic primary healthcare. All these put together have led to high levels of human development for over decades now, which has been recognized as the Kerala model. At the core of this model is a dedication to egalitarian redistribution of available resources and a commitment to the establishment of a people's democracy. This model has significantly been conditioned by the left in the historical emergence of communism from the confluence of anti-colonial movement, anti-caste movement, and the labor and peasant movements during the freedom struggle. Communism, emerging from the local needs and power relations, has then further dictated state policy in Kerala since its inception. One recent example that can be taken is with the regard to the economy. The Indian economy, which had already moved into a slowdown before the pandemic, saw its GDP crashing to a new low. To revive the economy, several states moved towards changing or rather diluting labor laws. These broadly included increased number of working hours, no inspection in small and medium enterprises with less than 50 workers, amending Industrial Disputes Act to ease layoffs and retrenchment. At the national level, government spending has been abysmally inadequate, despite clear indications of demand side issues in the economy. We note that here again, as in any period of crisis, an attempt has been made to bolster capitalist investment, provide stimulus to capital accumulation by diluting labor protection, resting on the determination of the working day. The push thus has been on cheapening of labor and creation of exploitable labor. In contrast, Kerala's amendments focus on easing red tape for investment without allowing for dilution of labor laws. Here it is worth remembering that the state of Kerala is a part of the Union of India, where states exist as federal units. The unitary bias in Indian polity has led to the understanding of the nation as a quasi federal union with a strong center. In this, the state itself lacks macroeconomic power, cannot fully control the flow of capital, protect its markets, collect income taxes, or adjust interest rates. Consequently, Kerala's governance has been conditioned by the centre's policies. The Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Acts were termed by Dr. Thomas Isaac and Professor Ramakumar as the neoliberal response to the fiscal crisis of the state in the latter part of the 1990s, forcing states into restrictive fiscal deficit targets and constraining their expenditure, thereby indicating a priority for big capital over the social sector. This is not to say that Kerala has fallen in line with the national governance strategy. Kerala's development trajectory, as literature on the Kerala model amply demonstrates, has been at variance with the centre's development strategies. Despite a strong unitary bias, it can be argued that the concept of democratic federalism, that is, the splitting and sharing of sovereignty among political entities, leaving no unit with supreme authority, as enshrined in the Constitution of India, is what also creates the space where states, in their relative autonomy from the Union, can chart a different trajectory. However, the increased curtailing of fiscal federalism and a strong unitary bias severely curbs states' autonomy, as has been marked by many tussles between the states and center over tax devolutions and other fiscal issues. Functioning in the quasi federal framework of India, the transformative potential of the Kerala model is limited and contingent upon the policies of the Government of India. Whatever changes the left leadership in Kerala is able to achieve in the shrinking relative autonomy of the state's institutional framework, it cannot override the perpetuation of the capitalist mode of production. To achieve that, affecting central policy is necessary, which requires a reach beyond the state of Kerala. This is what has led us to categorizing Kerala's strategy as surviving capitalism. Here we argue, as Pulanzas notes, that changes in the state in the relation between branches are not determined by the exterior role of these institutions, but rather a modification in the system of the state apparatus conditioned by the changes in relations of production and development of class struggle. In other words, the discussed changes that Kerala was able to initiate was not implemented by a benevolent leadership or government, but rather through grassroots mobilization and development of a citizenry which held governments accountable for their actions. This model has ensured that even when left parties have not formed the government, the state has not steered away from democratic people oriented initiatives. The role of unions, associations, and collectives must especially be marked here, which have significantly coordinated grassroots activity and put forth a collective front to hold governments accountable and through participation in decentralized planning led the development agenda. In this regard, one may find hope for the expansion of left polity in other parts of the country that was recently evidenced from the resurgence of the left in electoral politics in the state of Bihar. If any lessons have to be drawn from the Kerala model of development, one must note that Kerala's polity has emerged from a confluence of anti caste, anti imperialist working class movements. Till this expands to other states, Kerala's left polity can only survive and not overturn capitalism in India. From this, we can fairly conclude that the survival of the left movement in Kerala and perhaps in other parts of the country is contingent on its ability to continuously adapt to contemporary challenges and local needs, develop a communist socialist ideology through local needs and power relations without losing sight of its redistributive agenda, to realize social reform and establish finally a people's democracy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ashwin and Aishwarya. I want to remind viewers that they can begin to pose questions if they want in the chat on the YouTube channel, which will be read out at the when both papers have been delivered. So now Paromita is going to speak on the title, on a paper entitled "Such a Long Journey, Pandemic Moves the Indian State?" ? Paromita.
Thank you, Sebastian, for the introduction. The title of my paper is "Such a Long Journey, Pandemic Moves the Indian State." It's really a question that is the state moved by the humanitarian crisis that we have seen unfold in the country and of course around the world. A year ago, I want to go back before the pandemic struck, because this is really interesting, because a year ago, there was a rising resistance to the ruling party's Hindu chauvinist agenda and its neoliberal policies in the massive and widespread anti-CAA demonstrations that cut across communal divisions, huge peasant marches, and the biggest one-day general strike in history. Can you just keep changing the slides? Alongside, the BJP suffered losses in several key state assembly elections. The strikes and marches were against the neoliberal losses in the strikes and marches were against the neoliberal economic reforms, and the anti-CAA protests challenged the Hindu Rashtra project. Both economic and political policies were under considerable pressure from these mass movements. The time seemed rife with possibility of a real alternative. And then the pandemic struck. The central government used the pandemic to consolidate more power in the hands of few, openly practice crony capitalism, crush the resistance movements, and further the neoliberal agenda of market competition, privatization, dilution of labor laws, and public-private partnership. Yeah, next slide, please. The pandemic also revealed the true priorities of the government, which is profit over people. Now, this paper will show how the Indian state's response to the pandemic resulted in a humanitarian crisis, and how under the guise of the pandemic, the state intensified its overt and covert operations of capital and power and emboldened its agencies to brutalize, control, curb, extract, and dispossess. We will also address social inequality and discuss the way poor bodies were held responsible for the virus spread and treated as disposable commodities, both pointing to a moral crisis facing a state in denial and in disgust, a governing body that considers its citizens, in the words of Arundhati Roy, a hostile force that needs to be ambushed, taken by surprise, but never to be trusted. So in terms of the key fallouts of the pandemic, what we see is a complete unleashing of the neoliberal policies of the government, open practice of crony capitalism, and of course, crushing of the resistance movement that was so widespread and gave the possibility of an alternative just before the pandemic struck. If we consider a virus which has struck the world, we see that it is deadlier when it deepens inequality, widens social and economic divisions, and exacerbates the already polarized labor markets. Our experience with COVID-19 has been nothing short of devastating. This is true everywhere, but particularly of the global south, which was already grappling with scarcity, poverty, lack of proper sanitation and adequate health services, along with a rise in political violence, rampant privatization, and tightening of corporate control over natural resources and labor. The tragedy of sweeping scale is unfolding before our eyes. Loss of income, lack of health care as a result of the lockdowns, quarantine measures, and draconian state policies to stall the pandemic have not only caused death on a massive scale, but also a rise in precarity, the consequences of which will outlast the pandemic. People living from paycheck to paycheck are in a very different position than salaried employees who have a steady job and can work from home. The pandemic has as two Guardian columnists recently noted, not only revealed stark gaps in wealth, health, and work, but has also turned these disparities from chronic to acute ones. Inequality has certainly multiplied the virus's spread and deadly reach. The research confirms that inequality and poverty increase the rate of transmission and mortality manifold. What is deeply ironic is that the epidemic was spread by the well-heeled who traveled by air and brought the virus to different corners of the world. However, the ones who were scapegoated, blamed for rapid transmission, had no ability to travel abroad. In India, the slums were immediately identified as hotbeds of transmission, and stringent measures to contain the virus were firmly imposed. Middle class and upper class disgust and fear of the poor spiked, leading to a state where labor from slums were banned from domestic service, and with the closure of all business establishments apart from essential services, most were left jobless and consequently destitute. The long-term consequences of the pandemic will be a reinforcement of economic and social inequalities, a rise in communal violence and caste discrimination, and probably deaths of despair, as the New York Times report says, those occurring from alcoholism, suicide, or drug overdose. We can see that pre-existing social vulnerabilities will only get worse with this disaster. And what we also see is that low-income households are compelled to take higher risks to secure livelihood, and thus not only expose themselves to the possibility of contracting the virus, but also increase the chances of spreading it more broadly. So it is common knowledge that the poor are 10% more likely to suffer from pre-existing, chronic health conditions, and therefore they're consequently more likely to die of the virus than the well-off and the educated. The key issues that I want to focus on today is the migrant crisis and look at both the federal responses as well as the state response. I have already touched upon the middle class paranoia and disgust of poor bodies, where a new form of untouchability was practiced, where the domestic workers were banned from entering gated communities. There was a complete crushing of the resistance movements by an increasingly authoritarian state. And what I want to largely focus is the suspension of labor laws, which took place under the guise of the pandemic, opening up the doors to a trenchant and most exploitative neoliberal economic policy, and auction of coal mines, which showed the deregulation of key public enterprises and opened them up for corporate use and profit. On 24th March 2020, the Indian government announced a national lockdown in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, limiting the movement of people and closing all business operations barring essential services. Now, this was one of the most hastily taken decisions, and it was also one of the world's most severe lockdowns, which came into effect only with 4 hours notice. And what we see is unfolding of the migrant crisis, who had to, a large section of the migrant workers who work in the informal sector just started on a journey to go back home on foot. The government first ignored their plight and then failed to address the basic subsistence and transport needs of millions of migrant laborers. The crisis that resulted saw more than 300 deaths from exhaustion, starvation, suicides, road and rail accidents, police brutality, lack of food, and denial of timely medical care. So if you look at the internal migrants, the composition of internal migrants is around 40 million in the informal sector, and they were affected severely by the lockdown. Interstate transport was halted overnight. There was no infrastructure for transportation. What we saw was several public interest litigations filed in the Supreme Court of India and high courts of different states. But the Supreme Court took time to pass the order, which was passed on 9th June, almost 7 weeks after the crisis started. And the fallout of this delay was that the states were asked to provide transport while the buck was passed to the state from the center, and which also led to another crisis, which is a lack of a uniform policy to tackle migrant crisis. So what we saw was horrifying images of desperation, destitution, death resulting from the crisis. The delay in response and the subsequent orders of the Supreme Court clearly showed that the center's response was, number one, delayed, and number two, it was ad hoc and reactive. There was no involvement of experts on the government panel that studied the crisis. Migrant laborers were seen as a problem and as a burden on state resources. There was lack of proper interstate communication, leading to starvation, inaccessibility to food. While ironically, food was rotting in the Food Corporation of India, go downs, and area-specific ration cards, which the migrant laborers, most of them had, were not accepted by other states because they were moving into, there was interstate transportation and interstate movement. Hence, what we see is also the fact that there were special trains that were started for the migrant workers, which is all good, but there was massive overcrowding on those trains. And of course, the women, the infirm, the old, and the children on those trains probably, in most cases, would have not been able to get off at stations to secure food and water because there was no provision for food or water supply on the trains. So one can simply imagine the plight of, of all the people who formed a part of this harrowing exodus. We also see that, some states in their overzealousness treated the migrant workers as chattels, hosing them down with disinfectant, locking them up in pens and placing them under quarantine without adequate social distancing measures or proper sanitation and health facilities. In some villages, caste became an important vehicle of transmission of fear, harassment, assault, and all of that led to a multiplication of the crisis. So lack of involvement of people to render help to the migrants, people from the government side, people from people who are representatives of the government, became quite. It revealed the priorities of the government, that it was very clear that the migrant laborers were seen as the problem and feared as super spreaders. While, interestingly, the overseas migrants were brought back to India under the Vande Bharat mission, given special flights, naval ships deployed for safe passage. But what you see as contrast is lack of preparedness and care for internal migrants, who mostly make up the vulnerable precarious workforce. So the magnitude of internal migration is about 2.5 times, that of international migration. Yet the treatment that was meted out to them was one of apathy and ruthlessness. So internal migrants are truly made invisible. Ironically, they were very visible during the crisis. But even intellectually, if you look at the data collection that the government has, there is no robust data on remittances and contribution, even though the migrants do fuel Indian economy and their remittances provide a lifeline to poor households. A Kerala model, of course, is something that we can quote, and we've already heard that some states did a better job than others, but mostly this was a matter of huge failure. So I want to move on to the next part of my talk, which is that the pandemic certainly, deepened the already existing fault lines of class, caste, and religion. Over the years, we have seen how the present political dispension has deployed virulent nationalism, fear-mongering, scapegoating, and right-wing ideological claptrap to consolidate collective fear of the other. What we saw during the initial phases of lockdown is nothing short of an intractable and unrelenting state of emergency, where middle and upper class consolidated themselves by acting upon their prejudice, bigotry, and paranoia of those who have been made citizen suspect. We see that there were renewed right-wing offensives during the pandemic. And I want to now focus on the suspension of labor laws in key ruling party states. The government revealed plans for a renewed offensive by tabling new farm bills and reforms in labor laws during the pandemic. Under the pretext of the pandemic, several states sought temporarily to revise labor laws by way of ordinances, amendments, or executive orders. This was done with the purpose of attracting corporate capital and finance, and also giving employers a blanket 3-year exemption from all labor laws. And if you see the slides, you can see that the offensive was so intense that employers not only can just hire and fire, but they can also increase working hours in factories. Registration can now be done in 1 day instead of 30 days. Industrial units were exempted from most of the provisions under the Industrial Disputes Act. And all of this clearly showed that the rights of workers were completely suspended. And what you have is a huge encouragement to exploitation of labor. 80 to 90% of the Indian workforce is part of the informal economy without a formal contract. The trend in recent decades clearly show that even the organized sectors are being casualized. Ad hoc and temporary employment are on the rise, leading to dangerous levels of precarity. And what we see during the COVID-19 crisis is, next slide please, that some of the states, for instance, suspended 35 out of 38 labor laws, including Minimum Wages Act, thus effectively enabling an environment of total exploitation. So stripping the workers of their rights and also passing amendments without public consultation, without due process, all clearly shows the priority of the government, that it is profit over people. Instead of offering wage subsidies or furlough schemes like many other countries in the world did, what we see is that there was almost not only just wage slavery, but also workers were forced to be at the mercy of their employers, leaving them with no mechanism of redress, as the suspension of these laws meant that the trade unions cannot raise a dispute. So what we see is suspension of labor laws are done to protect the employer, while the welfare of the employee has been totally disregarded, depriving them of the means to secure social and economic justice. So my next question is, yes, can we move on? Next slide, please. What is the government's response to the suspension of labor laws? Now, the Indian state projected that the dilution of labor laws was to benefit the economy. It was beneficial for investment and employment generation. However, the consequences of suspension of labor laws would lead to a further dip in income, increasing inequality, and of course, lower purchasing power, which means it will slow down the already sluggish economy. The deliberate neglect and exploitation of the labor force also is a direct result of authoritarianism, pandering to corporate capital, promoting austerity and politics of exclusion as practiced by the neoliberal state. And we also see that there is a precedence given to finance big businesses over people. And what we see is also a plunging of into a crisis which shall have long-term ramifications on public health, public distribution system, state of the economy, natural environment, and labor and human rights. So my next question is, yes, next slide, please. What moves the Indian state? The Indian state is definitely moved by neoliberal policies, but the neoliberal policies that have been in place for decades now is clearly not working. I mean, you see the fault lines and failures in the context of the pandemic. It has unleashed havoc and misery on millions of vulnerable people, has exacerbated both economic and social inequalities, intensified communal divisions, and the rest, the ravaging of a natural environment, safeguarding of corporate interests. And of course, we can't forget that there's massive surveillance and data collection under the pretext of the pandemic, where you download an app where the data is being collected, and then probably the data can be used by corporates. So what moves the Indian state? Next slide, please. The Indian state is moved only by the needs of those in majority, by those who own capital. It is unfazed by the plight of the disorganized poor, unresponsive to the demands of justice and fair trial for those who've been accused and are languishing in jail, for instance. And of course, unabashed by expropriation of labor rights. In addition, during the pandemic, natural resources were parceled out to big corporations by way of offering mining contracts. Particularly notable is the awarding of a contract for the Dhiroli coal mine in Madhya Pradesh to a port-to-power conglomerate, Adani Enterprises. This is interesting because this was the first ever auction for coal mines without any restrictions. And it has already begun on November 2nd, 2020. And we see that this is a sign of things to come. Strong opposition by the Coal India Limited unions had prevented this sector from being deregularized or deregulated. However, the present government has been able to go on the offensive, crush the powerful labor unions, slowly dismantle the state-owned CIL, which is Coal India Limited, after allowing it to practically become inoperable and defunct, and now ready to sell it to private and foreign investors. The commercial mining will begin with auctioning of mines, with the bidding regulations considerably eased for investors. The deregulation of the sector means that tribal populations who live in the mineral reserve belts of India will face certain dispossession, loss of land and livelihood, and forced destitution or migration to urban centers for work. The government moved quietly on the question of suspension of labor laws under the pretext of the pandemic. This was done to protect the employer, and it has also moved very quietly on the questions of natural environment, protection of natural environment, labor, and human rights. What we also see is that there is an opportunity. I mean, it sounds awful and it sounds very dark and dismal, but there are, of course, opportunities, even in the middle of a crisis. This is an era of massive global inequality, political unrest, economic downturn. Our state adoption of the neoliberal agenda has wreaked havoc on people and ravaged our natural environment. But we also can see that there are ways in which we can fight neoliberal order. We know that what the state of India is moved by is the force of neoliberal capitalism. For the state, the health of the economy is priority rather than the health of the people. COVID-19 has highlighted the need for a new world order that is not based on ruthless profiteering, capital accumulation, and exploitation of labor. The neoliberal state, of course, will take control of the public discourse and spin a narrative where business owners and employers are presented as the real victims of the pandemic. The framing of this is a rehash of what neoliberal governments did around the globe after the 2008 financial crash, bailing out the banks to save the economy. This time around, the neoliberal state is once again under pressure from businesses to open up the economy in a bid to let markets take control and also resolve the present crisis. While giving more power to private players and entrepreneurs to extract and accumulate, the government, through contract tracing apps, as I have already said, sets up this massive surveillance mechanism. And what we see is that it is very clear that pandemic has, for at least in the Indian context, exposed the priorities of the government. I want to conclude now by talking about what are the opportunities for us. Yes, we have seen that the government priorities are exposed. We have also seen massive resistance movements that cut across communal lines in the form of anti-CAA protests, which was taking a very intense shape just before the pandemic struck. We've seen a lot of people's resistance movements towards neoliberal economic policies by way of farmers' march and workers' strikes. We also see an opposition to the idea of a monolithic Hindu nation and its attendant communal project, not just in ordinary people, but also in centers of intellectual opposition at the universities. So the time is ripe, really, for an alternative to at least take shape. The massive protest that India saw just before the lockdown shows the enormous potential to challenge the political, economic, ideological agenda that we see at the center. It also shows a level of political consciousness that is potentially the embryo of an alternative secular movement that can transcend communal divisions. The right-wing project depends upon fomenting communal divisions. But for the left, this is an opportunity. And the left must make use of this opportunity to build public opinion on the success of the Kerala model for managing crisis, bring the disparate people's movements under political leadership for organizational and ideological coherence. And you have disparate movements like anti-caste, anti-CA, peasant movements, women's movements, labor movements, and other significant resistance movements. These disparate movements cannot be sustained unless it gives rise to a political leadership that gives it organizational and, as I said, ideological coherence. And what we see is that the parliamentary left must ally with other organized groups that resist neoliberal policies and support anti-caste movements and challenge communal politics. The left must build on strikes that India has seen in recent times and put their energies in creating public opinion and consciousness raising about the benefits of organized resistance, social welfare, and collective bargaining rights. We must now convert the rising number of strikes into coherent strategy and strengthen our trade unions. We must take inspiration from the Kerala model by demanding a policy of decentralized governance, and we must secure labor rights and maintain proper wage contracts to end labor exploitation in the informal sector. So I think it is time to give a clarion call to end the neoliberal order and build a more assertive and politically conscious, collectively organized civil society, and build strong trade unions which can resist, challenge capitalism, and take control of resources that are necessary for human survival pending revolution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paromita. Well, firstly, do the speakers want to say anything to each other? Are there any comments or questions you'd like to pose to each other before we start with the more general round of questions? Ashwin, Aishwarya?
Not really a question, but just some general comments. We found it really interesting about how Paromita was talking about the fact that the middle class had this disgust for workers and poor bodies. And we thought it was an interesting contrast to what we were seeing in Kerala, where the government actually termed migrant workers as guest workers and provided a lot of opportunities for them to stay back comfortably, using, I think, 4 to 5 translations of instructions, depending on where the migrant workers were from, and so on and so forth. So it was quite interesting to see how different the visualization or the conceptualization of the worker is across these two scenarios. And yeah, I think at this stage, that's all. And I think we can maybe go into discussion.
If I can just jump in, I think the disgust of the poor workers was most evident in entitled enclaves of urban India, where poor workers who have served for decades, as maids, as servants, as drivers and cooks, were suddenly seen as the untouchables. It was a new form of, untouchability that was being practiced, and these bodies were suddenly, made disposable, as well as there was a legitimate form of disgust for them, which is really interesting because they were just turned into bodies that are super spreaders. They were not seen as people who worked or served, or I mean, it was strange. It was really strange. And it clearly showed the kind of privilege and entitlement that urban India has, and how it is blindsided by that. So
also, your question about what moves the Indian state was quite interesting, because it reminded me of a quote by, I would probably be paraphrasing it, but Minister Shailaja had said somewhere that no one in the state should be suffering because we don't care enough. That humane approach, or that element of leaders caring for the people in that state, I just felt like that kind of connected to your question of what is moving the state really.
Right, but that is also a bit complicated, because then you see the state as a parent, and you see the state as, as in Hindi we say the Mai Baap, the Sarkar.
Right. Of course.
So yes, but at least, as you rightly pointed out, that we've not come to a state where there is a complete overhaul of the system. Our state is still sort of a paternal figure.
Yeah.
And yeah, it is an uncaring, state in terms of the pandemic. But yes, the Kerala model certainly serves as a path for other states to emulate till we find a radical alternative.
Paromita, did you have any questions or comments you wanted to address to Ashwin or Aishwarya at this point? Paromita, you hear me?
Yes, sorry?
Did you have any questions or comments you wanted to address to Aishwarya or Ashwin at this point?
So I think Aishwarya and Ashwin's paper really dealt with specifics and brought out very clearly what exactly were the strategies that the government of Kerala, adopted in order to handle and manage the crisis. So I think it's something that we all benefited from by knowing exactly what were the practical aspects of handling the crisis, because it's easier to talk in terms of general apathy and lack of care, but the Kerala model certainly is an inspirational one as of now, and I think the left must make opportunities of turning this into sort of a public consciousness raising mode. So yeah, thanks so much for the paper.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have some questions beginning to come in on the YouTube chat. I again encourage people who have questions or comments to pose them in the YouTube chat, and I'll read them out. So first of all, from Terry Dunn, I think this is for Ashwin and Aishwarya. 2 questions. First question is, what accounts for the confluence of anti-caste, anti-colonial, labor and agrarian movements in Kerala in the first place? Why did it take a different direction in the mid-20th century? And the second question from Terry is, how does Kerala compare to other Indian states where historically the CPs have been strong? Then we have a question from Pinar Kaya, who says, can you share, this presumably for both sets of speakers, can you share your opinions on results of the Bihar elections? Is there any COVID-19 related electoral change? Then we have a question from Paul Reynolds, who says, on Kerala, if you use a Balancian approach, should you be inclined to an analysis that sees the local state as able to respond more effectively because of a different condensation of class forces than other states, but reinforcing the rule of capital rather than communism? Is that what surviving is? And is it not still surviving exploited and dispossessed, but perhaps less so than others? So we'll go those set of questions first, and then
yeah. Yeah, so I think we'll start responding as they were posted. What accounts for the confluence of anti-caste, anti-colonial labor and agrarian movements in Kerala? If we look at the history of the communist movements, the emergence of the communist movement, we see EMS's writings are very useful in sort of contextualizing how it emerged. You note that the class movement really emerged from other social movements that were a consequence of inequality in the region. And these were different regions. This is even before Kerala as a state has been formed. It was this recognition of local socially exploiting systems, and the recognition of these local social systems in confluence with imperialism and feudalism, that was recognized by the early leadership as the bane of Kerala society. So emerging from this emerging from this confluence, EMS recognizes in his writings the problem in Kerala as Brahmanism, landlordism, and imperialism. And so the development strategy is then based on these local movements. It derived from an understanding, a theoretical understanding of what is the socially exploitative system in practice in Kerala, in the region of Kerala. And there are these three predominant regions that come together to form subsequently the state of Kerala, had their own contributions to the movement. So anti-caste movement led by Srinarayana Guru is a major recognition that the left has done in the state, where CPIM recognizes the movement as, or identifies it as Kerala Renaissance. V.S. Achyutanandan in an interview had stated that today we need a new Renaissance movement to really counter the neoliberal state onslaught and the rise of global right. The other questions.
There was also the question about how the record in Kerala of the CPs compares to other states where CPs have had power.
Yeah, so there has been, we are not probably the best people to speak on the record of other CPs in other states, because we've not really charted the trajectory of communist parties in other states. But, and I can only give you a very brief overview of what literature on the communist movement has said. They've said that they've identified that charting an orthodox theoretical move has been the bane of left movements and left parties in other states, electorally speaking, at least. I think I would argue that electoral relevance should not be seen as the benchmark of left movements. It's really these trade union movements, these grassroots organization of social society, that has to be seen as the benchmark of how active the left movement is. And I think in that context, maybe we can briefly touch on the question of Bihar, where it's too early to say anything about what is the or what the left resurgence in Bihar state election says. But it is very clearly, it is in these internal regions of Bihar where a significant left electorate is coming up. And this is based on grassroots mobilization, addressing local concerns and local needs. This, of course, has not significantly altered the state formation in the state. It's the same state coming back. But the change in electoral tendency is something that needs to be marked, and then strategies from that can be built forward.
And the question from Paul, again, to repeat it, if you use a Palancian approach, should you be inclined to an analysis that sees the local state as able to respond more effectively than the national state, because of a different condensation of class forces than other states? But this would still be reinforcing the rule of capital rather than communism. Is that what surviving is? And is it not still surviving exploited and dispossessed, but perhaps less so than in other places?
Yeah, I would say that is what surviving is, because unless as we in our paper sort of mentioned in that the power sharing relations in the quasi-federal union have to be affected in such a way that the center has to really take a stand on nationalization, socialist policies, etc. But if you look at the question of decentralized planning, it is, as Paul says, it is the local state is more effective in responding to local needs because of the local condensation of class forces. In our presentation, I hope we did not sort of present this idea that Kerala is this radically egalitarian society. It's still trying to respond to severe backlash by the conservative orthodox forces. Even when the first ministry came up, there was something called the Vimojana Sabanam, or the liberation struggle, where the orthodox forces really came together. So this coming together to form an anti-communist front has been something that you see every 2 terms in Kerala state government formations. Surviving exploited and dispossessed, yes, but as Paromita also in her presentation noted, that developing strategies, raising consciousness across the country from existing models is something that can only be taken up, and then maybe a national strategy. Again, the onus of this lies on not just the largest communist party, but various left parties that have come up. So the one model that one may be able to take examples from in Kerala is that Kerala governments have been coalition governments for many years. And these coalition governments are confluence of various left parties. It's not, Thomas Isaac had once pointed out that if you have to understand the left movement in Kerala, do not go by the story of CPI or CPIM alone. Understand the left movement amongst the various other local parties that have come together to form the state governments. The emergence of the left movement that is disparate, diverse, taking up several issues which may be contradictory to the hegemonic party's opinion, but that is what sort of brings together this idea of coalitional and decentralized planning and governance.
Just to quickly add to it, the 2 main coalitions in Kerala, the LDF and the UDF. The LDF is the Left Democratic Front. Interestingly, even in the UDF, you have some left parties. So the point that we were making earlier about how even when the left party is not in power, the LDF is not in power, the state does not get steered away from pursuing people-centric policies. And Paul is absolutely right in talking about local level politics. And I think that has been brought out more strongly in this pandemic as well, where you did see there was local level mobilization, which actually ensured that people were doing okay during the pandemic. And that has a lot to do with the level of decentralized governance that exists in Kerala, where you have very strong local level bodies. But of course, it's as he rightly pointed out, surviving perhaps in a way which is less exploitative than the others. So I think we would concede that.
Just an additional point, perhaps, that's important, is that in Kerala there's been an alternation of power between the left parties and the parties around Congress, which wasn't the case in West Bengal for a long period of time.
Yeah.
And this perhaps is a form of accountability for the left parties that is stronger than when you have unrivaled power for many decades. Paromita, there are a few questions for you. So apart from the question about Bihar or anything else you want to respond to, Paul says, I applaud Paromita's optimism, but I do wonder to what extent the political possibilities for the left in India or elsewhere are offset by both the dispersal of protest by lockdown and the projection of nationalist solidarities as a populist feature for state responses. I think it's part of a larger question of exploiting ruptures and events against the resilience of capital. This comes from a pessimist. This comes from a pessimist. Roland Rodriguez says, what is the road ahead for Mumbai specifically and Maharashtra at large, considering it is a territory which relies heavily on the migrant contribution? Any change of attitude required? Question mark.
Okay. In response to the first comment of Paul, yes, optimism of the will, pessimism of the intellect, I would say, right? I understand where you're coming from. We have seen some great movements before the pandemic, so that is where the optimism comes from, that if the left could have harnessed the energies that those movements really made very visible, then maybe there is a strategy for the left to turn around, not just in terms of a parliamentary left which looks only at elections and looks at winning seats and electoral politics, but a grassroots change of consciousness from a very local perspective, as Ashwin and Aishwarya were talking about. That's a real possibility of change, where left workers go into the villages or into local areas and start consciousness building, talk about their successes, use a lot of disparate movements to their advantage, bring them together under political leadership. So yes, there is hope, but as you rightly said, the protests have been dispersed because under the guise of the pandemic, this was the first thing that the government did, that basically just wrapped up the Shaheen Bagh protest movement, which was one of the most inspiring in recent times. It was a women-led movement, and we saw octogenarians sitting at the protest site for days, 101 days of protest, and spreading rapidly across India, and across, and basically just decimating the communal divide story that we see all the time in India. But yes, I mean the strikes and these protests have been stopped because of the pandemic, but the pandemic is not going to last forever. The protests will continue, the strikes will come back. So at that point in time, post-pandemic, I think the left must make use of these movements that have radical potential for an alternative. That has to be seized. And the government will, of course, come down with brute force and crush these, movements. But if there is a strong support, if there is organized political support from left parties, then it will not be so easy to crush them and to basically just decimate these resistance movements, because these are our only hopes. And the narrative of national solidarity and virulent nationalism and how we have to protect ourselves against the enemy is also something that will last only till we allow it to last. I mean, I can see as a teacher working in college with young people, I can see that there is a change of attitude in young people, particularly. I mean, they want to see change, and I think the narrative of singular nationalism, monolithic identity cannot. It has been successful, quite successful for a while, but I don't see it as a permanent, as a structure that will be imposed on us permanently. I think India is too big for that, and we're too diverse, and I think the left and of course, people like us who are constantly in touch with young people, we all have a responsibility of constantly, fighting back against that idea, pushing back against that idea, resisting it. So I think I'm an optimist when it comes to, thinking that an alternative is possible, and the left, if it's ingrained in Stalinist politics, it will be difficult for the left. But if there's a new leadership that emerges from the left, considering the Bihar election, considering the coalition movements, considering disparate left-leaning movements, we may see a ray of hope, and who knows, an alternative. So to answer the second question, Maharashtra, particularly Mumbai, is heavily dependent on migrant labor. I mean, I think the entire city is built by migrant labor, and to be honest, migrant laborers, a lot of them left, some of them didn't, and a lot of the people in the city cares about migrant workers. But as I said, there was also a deep sense of fear and disgust of the workers, and they were seen as super spreaders, particularly also the ones who were living in the slums. But I certainly think this pandemic will have given an opportunity for all people who live in gated communities, who work in a privileged, are privileged, can work from home. We must introspect, and we must see that without the migrants, without their work, this city is going to collapse. So I think the pandemic will effect a change in attitude, and when the migrant workers come back, which I don't know when they will, but certainly there will be a sort of return of migrant workers for livelihood. We can only hope that there will be a change in attitude, and people will see them as labor and not as bodies, disposable commodities. So yeah, I am hopeful.
Okay, I had a few questions for Ashwin and Aishwarya. So, I mean, I fully recognize what you say. I think it's now, accepted. Even, there've been articles in the bourgeois press that the Kerala model has been more successful, obviously, than other states in India, and more successful in dealing with the pandemic than many, advanced capitalist states. But I did find your picture a little bit too rosy, I have to say. It was completely uncritical of the Kerala left government. And I mean, I understand why you want to, give a positive narrative, but I think it's important for us to be as sober as possible. So, I mean, the first thing, question of definition, you talk about people's democracy, which is not a term that in the West we're familiar with anymore, because it comes from the Orthodox communist movement and was the name of those states in Eastern Europe and elsewhere where there was no form of workers' democracy at all, no free trade unions, no multi-party systems, and so on. So I'm curious to know what you mean by, I'm assuming that you don't want that, so I'm assuming that I'd be interested to know what you understand by people's democracy, because it's a very loaded term, at least for those of us in the West. The second thing is, of course, I'm not an expert on the Kerala model, but I have read some accounts that are more critical than yours of it. My reading is particularly influenced by a book by Praful Bidwai called The Phoenix Moment, Challenges Confronting the Indian Left, which I think is a very good overview of the various contradictions of the Indian left more broadly. And in his chapter on Kerala, which is entitled Cracks in the Kerala Edifice, he says the following. He says, and it'd be interesting for you to react to this. He says, even the left, in particular the CPM, is not spared by the mighty tide of the new economic processes. Under their impact, the size and potential weight of the working class has decreased in the larger society. The party now mirrors this decline. Thus, a key recent development is the convergence between two tendencies. A smaller proportion of the traditional working class is politically conscious and active, and secondly, its growing lack of participation in the CPM means that it influences the party's politics less and less. In the absence of substantive political struggles, the role of the working class in the CPM politics is mostly reduced to sustaining the CITU and participating in rallies held at the time of party conferences and elections. He says then further on, since the 1990s, a massive transformation has occurred in the CPM, especially in northern Kerala. A shift from cooperatives to corporations. CPM started small as an economic entity. It set up primary credit cooperatives headed by local party officials, which prioritized credit flow to the cadre and fellow traveling middle class. A host of landloom weaving cooperatives and beedi rolling cooperatives were also established to provide bare sustenance to the poorer party workers and sympathizers and to advance the ideology of communism amongst the rural masses. The party was run almost entirely on members' levies and small contributions from well-wishers. However, the party leadership has since then developed cozy relations with property speculation, lottery operators, and shady businessmen. It has made a special effort to affluent immigrants who by and large retain their traditional party loyalties by regularly sending out fund collection to the Gulf states to raise resources. All of this has had harmful social, political, strategic, and organizational consequences in de-radicalizing the left, ideologically pushing it in a right-wing direction and alienating it further from poor and underprivileged workers and peasants. The class character of the CPM has changed to such an extent that its 19th Congress, held in April 2012, was organized not by party cadres or volunteers, but by a corporate event management company with a reported budget of 5 crore, unheard of in the history of India's communist movement, which used to take pride in its Spartan lifestyle and simplicity that befits a party of poor working people. And of course, there's a lot more detail in his chapter about specific changes in Kerala's society and economics that have had this influence on the CPM. So he's really making quite a strong claim about the sociological shift in the CPM, character of the CPM, which has an influence on its politics. The third point I wanted to raise with you is you quoted Polantzas, but of course Polantzas also argues strategically that the road to socialism has to be a combined road. There is an electoral aspect to it of a struggle within the state apparatus, but that is dependent on the second leg, if you like, which is the mobilization of forces outside of the state apparatus, working class and other popular forces, organized, self-organized through their own institutions. Is there any sign of that in Kerala? I know, for example, that there was a popular planning campaign some years back to try and decentralize the planning process, but that seems to have been largely abandoned, I understand. And it was still, a top-down model. What evidence is there that a Polanskian strategy, which you seem to be suggesting is the strategy being followed in Kerala, is actually in place in that second dimension, the dimension of self-organization and self-mobilization of the working masses?
So thank you, Sebastian, for your comment suggestions. I think we completely agree with everything that you pointed out, and yes, we were worried that this might present too rosy a picture, but the idea was to sort of bring out the positives without necessarily, and probably we failed in doing that, but without necessarily presenting a very idealistic picture. About the changes in CPM, as you quoted from Praful Bidwai, that's we completely agree with that. The idea that we wanted to present sort of in our paper was not so much associated with how the CPM has fared or the largest communist party in the state is faring, but rather with this observation that collectivizing and proposing a collective front is seen as this basic model of resistance and assertion of your agenda, of your development patterns, etc. And you see that in the current and the points that you mentioned about the class character of CPM changing, the most recent
Of course, we were not trying to present a very rosy picture of Kerala. We just kind of focused on these details which were relevant to the pandemic, probably because we thought that we just have 15 minutes, so we kind of got into it. But of course, those fissures are there in the state where, if you take gender, for example, you see that Kerala has excellent human development indicators for women. But at the same time, paradoxically, it faces a very high rate of high incidence of violence against women, dowry deaths, and so on. And there are movements happening on the ground against all of this. That discussion is there, of course, and that critique of the party, as well as perhaps policies that didn't work, is there in the discourse, and it's there in the discussion that's there in the state. And of course, you were right, because I mean, in terms of whether or not it's right wing in its policies. Of course, I mean, that can be debated, but you did see Geeta Gopinath of the IMF being appointed as the financial advisor to the chief minister, which is quite funny for a left government to do. So, of course, those points are well taken. And yeah, I think people's democracy.
Yeah, so about the People's Planning campaign that you mentioned, there have been issues regarding that. People have pointed out that although People's Planning campaign was this big rhetoric that the state had come up with, but they've completely almost sort of abandoned it now, because decentralized planning, because it was top down, decentralized planning also decentralized corruption. So of course there are fissures. It's not about people's democracy. This is, I understand, when you pointed out, it became more apparent. We were sort of using people's democracy in the way the state has used this in its rhetoric to argue about people's participation through decentralized planning. And that's how they implemented the People's Planning campaign also. All points are completely taken. And was there anything else?
I think that's that. I mean, essentially, what we were trying to point out was the value in having coordinated grassroots level activity, which also goes hand in hand with a citizenry which has had a raised level of consciousness in that sense, and that kind of goes back to the practice of, say, having reading rooms in Kerala when the communists went underground. Maybe you can speak a bit about that.
About how they planted themselves in each village block, started reading room discussions to talk about local politics, raise consciousness through those methods. It was this community involvement that as a practice is still followed. Would have diminished with the largest party perhaps, but which is why I sort of in the discussion also mentioned that one has to look at other left parties that have come up, fissures within the left party, and how the strategies have been changing. Of course, it's led by the dominant party, but I think it's important to look at these aspects about how local movements are emerging. And this collectivization is not something that is strategic only to the left in Kerala. This collectivization is something that the right wing is also very, very strictly doing. Pulanza's the combined road.
Yeah, so we kind of addressed that.
Yeah.
I think that.
I hope we addressed.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, that's helpful. Just on the question of other left parties, I mean, it is the case also that there have been cases of violence and assassination.
Absolutely. Yes.
Of other left parties, including
Yeah.
the Revolutionary Communist Party,
Yeah.
is politically assassinated. So
Yeah, absolutely. Violence with the left parties in the state has been a big issue. Strikes turning extremely violent has been a big issue. So all those points are completely well taken.
thanks. Paromita, do you have any comments you wanted to add?
Well, on the question of Bihar elections and lessons to be learned from the pandemic, I think we do have an opportunity that we should not lose. And in the local, I think, local activism and allying with parties which are anti-communal and anti-neoliberal, I think is are some of the most important ways in which I think we can build an alternative. Yeah, because my paper really tried to show what the state has not done and how it has not really moved, not really been a caring state, which we can't expect also a neoliberal state to be. But if this is, if the pandemic has taught us anything, it has really exposed the failures and fault lines of the neoliberal project. I think it's time that one harnesses the energies that are present in all these disparate movements and bring them together to offer an alternative to people. But as I also understand and fear that the right wing is also coalescing and also consolidating on the ground. So yes, there will be a lot of contradictions, a lot of clashes, but yeah, this moment I think needs to be seized. Yeah.
Right. Well, I had a question for you about your paper, actually. So, I mean, I didn't disagree with any of it, but I was wondering, what does that lead you to in terms of a conceptualization of the nature of the current Indian state? Because, the BJP is not simply carrying out the orders of big capital. They have their own political and ideological agenda, which in some ways can conflict or hamper the immediate interests of at least sections of big capital. I mean, I don't think that the way they carried out the lockdown, for example, and the expulsion of migrant labor was particularly helpful for the accumulation of capital in India. So do you see the Indian state as, bourgeois state like anywhere else that is in some way trying to interpret and condense and express the interests of capital at large, the capital in general, national capital of India? Or do you see it as acting on behalf of a section or a fraction of Indian capital, certain monopolists and crony capitalists and so on that they are favoring, and those who buy into their ideological agenda? I mean, of course, the danger of that latter interpretation would be that it would give succor to a kind of left reformist views that, we need another, national government to represent the interests of good Indian capitalists as against ideologically fanatical Indian capitalists. But how exactly do you understand the relationship between the current government and the way it's remolding the state and Indian capital?
Right. I think, it's a very good question, because it is a question that troubles me too, because on one hand, if you see the communal project that the present government has initiated and has been emboldened by and has also accelerated, goes in a way is contrary to the interests of capital, because if there is turbulence, and there will be massive resistance, if there is turbulence in Indian society with regards to this juggernaut of this communal project, road rolling the diverse fabric of the country, Indian capital will suffer. And keeping that in mind, the state seems to be walking a sort of tightrope. It panders to the big capitalists, it panders to certain, certain corporate interests. But if you see, it really does not take into account petty bourgeois or small businesses or corporations that do not subscribe to their ideology. And that, I think, is a contradiction that can be made use of by the alternate political presence in the country. So to answer your question, I think there is some sort of a contradiction between what the Indian state wants to do, that is, of course, promote and consolidate the project of a monolithic Hindu nation. But it is also a project that will go against the interests of the capitalists. So on one hand, if it is a neoliberal state, then it has to make sure that there is stability in the social order, and cannot afford to have riots and communal discord and people basically not being able to get on with life and buy and sell. So if that's not happening, then obviously the economy will suffer. And if the economy suffers, then obviously capitalists will not be happy. So the Hindutva project also is running counter to good economic sense. And capitalists would not, I think, would not encourage the Indian state to, take it, to intensify this, the communal project. But what I think will happen is, if there is no strong opposition and if there is no real alternative, then very slowly there will be a dismantling of the democratic processes. A few capitalists, very big corporations will survive. There will be capital in the hands of few, and there may be a very strong possibility that the state would become enormously authoritarian and control culture. So there'll be a lot of control over over culture, but finance will be in the hands of few corporate giants. I don't know what really the future is, but certainly it seems that that's the strategy that the Indian state is currently adopting. Slow, very slow, sort of under the cover, covert operations of capital along with the communal project, where they're trying to really balance it out. So I don't see any sort of intense, taking up of the communal project, because it goes against the interests of the capitalists. But there will be a slow dismantling of democratic processes if we are not very careful and if we are not conscious and resist. Yes.
Thank you. Okay. We don't have any further questions in the YouTube chat, so maybe there's an opportunity for both sets of speakers to offer some concluding comments if they want, or Ashwin and Aishwarya.
As concluding comments, I think broadly from this discussion, what we have taken back is this necessity of active theoretical recognition of what the condition really is right now. Not only of how Paromita has pointed out, how the state in India, the government of India as a union is responding, but also what are the power relations that are populating the local power structures, the local societies, how local village level, block level power relations, regional aspects are changing because of this changing nature of capitalism, how communalism, how resurgence in communalism and orthodox ideologies are changing local level power relations. And that is our big takeaway, is that drawing from the history of the movement, the communist movement in Kerala, it's important to identify strategies from a bottoms-up approach. And that is what as Sebastian, you've also pointed out, that the question of a Polanyian approach really helps in checking both. Is the electoral agenda, is the state level activity connected with grassroots mobilization and local level assertions? And whether local level assertions are actually finding a way in the state. It's this two-way approach that can really be sort of a benchmark to identify which or what would be a successful strategy. Having said that, as abstractions go, as local power relations emerged into state relations, emerged into national agendas, the site of local power relations should not be ignored or dismissed as irrelevant. I think that is the biggest fault line, if any, in electoral politics or left strategies. Yeah.
Thanks, Paromita.
Yeah, so for me, I think the biggest, the most important reason why we need to put up a fight is that the structure, the democratic, secular structure of the country remains intact till we have an alternative where equality, justice, and food for all, food security becomes a reality. But till then, I think if we are still going to be part of an electoral system, then for us the pandemic is a huge opportunity to consolidate the gains that have been made just before the pandemic. So I think this is the lockdown, for instance, has given time for introspection for not just citizens but also for the political parties. And the Bihar elections has, with large number of with electoral gains that the left has made in Bihar, the farmers' protest in Punjab, I think we are staring at some sort of a tipping point where things may move either way. So the pandemic certainly is a moment of reckoning, and for us, so for all of us, I think it's important that we concentrate our forces and our efforts and our energies on local, small, organized movements and bring them together so that all these disparate energies can coalesce into something really powerful and beautiful. Yeah, I think that's what I would wish for the most post-pandemic.
Thanks, Paromita. So thank you both sets of speakers for this session. I wanted to bring everyone's attention to the fact that we have 2 more sessions on the pandemic today. At 1600 hours GMT, we have Politics of the Pandemic Panel 1, which has the speakers Rob Wallace, the epidemiologist, Richard Seymour, Josep Maria Antentas from Barcelona, and George Nikolaidis. And at 1830 GMT, Politics of the Pandemic Panel 2, with Mike Davis, Andreas Malm, and Panayotis Soteris. I also wanted to strongly encourage you all to take up the various offers that we have made available at the moment. The subscription offer, which has already been mentioned, 25% reduction for subscriptions. The 50% offer, 50% off offer from Haymarket Books for the book series titles. I also want to encourage anybody who's in a position to consider making a donation. Obviously, organizing this online conference was less expensive than organizing the usual London conference, but it still has incurred costs, which we need to try to cover. So if you're in a position to make a contribution of any type, then please do so. And I wanted to also bring to your attention that the conference continues tomorrow, of course. Last day of the conference is tomorrow, Sunday, where we have 3 sessions: Historicizing Law and Capitalism, New Directions, then 21st Century Socialism, and Marxism and Identity Politics. So those are the 3 last sessions tomorrow on the last day of the conference. Thank you very much to all of the speakers, and let's hope that next year or in following years we will be able to meet in person in London or elsewhere.
Thank you for having us. This was a very enriching discussion, and we learned a lot from all the comments, the paper, the panel. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Sebastian, and thank you, Jaz, for sharing my PPT and helping me with it. Thank you very much.